A little bit about me. I'll give you, got it. Thank you. I'll just give a little bit of background about why I'm here presenting, what my knowledge base is based on, so you guys can kind of understand my background a bit. A clinical social worker. I've been in the field for 25 plus years, primarily focused on children in different ways, and parenting and education in different ways. I was an early childhood educator before I ended up becoming a social worker, so I kind of have lived on both sides and wear both hats, and I'm a mother, so I certainly have perspective from the parenting lens as well when we're talking about kids. And I'm sorry, I just have to say this. Hi, Olivia, sweetheart. I recognize one of the little ones there. Um, I have worked in so many different settings, from early intervention to early Head Start, to domestic violence shelters with mothers, to home for teenage mothers, to outpatient pediatric clinics. I've really kind of put my feet in a lot of different areas. I've worked in schools, in middle schools, elementary schools, early childhood centers, as a developmental specialist, as well as a social worker. So my knowledge base that I bring to you comes from my experience, not only from my trainings and from that, but from all the amazing colleagues I've worked with in all those different settings. And I especially want to give a shout out to my former colleagues in early intervention, because my true understanding of sensory integration really came from the amazing occupational therapists and speech pathologists and all these other clinicians who really helped me see children in different lens than my clinical social work training and my education training really gave me. And it was like, it just clicked. It's like looking through one lens and then hearing their lens, and it just fit and it made so much sense. And so that's how I bring you this particular training, What Makes Your Child Tick, because of the puzzle pieces for me coming together, hearing from their lens and how they look at children. So I just wanted to give credit to them and to explain to you how this training was put together. So currently I have a private practice in Natick, Massachusetts. I work with children, parents, and adults. I am also virtual, although I like to see my kiddos in the playground, in the playroom, because it's just better to have them here. And I work with kids with a variety of focus. But my specialty is really working with parents and empowering them. I do parent coaching, where I help parents understand their kids. And I do parent counseling, where I help parents understand themselves, because who we are in reaction to our kids really matters. So that's a big piece of my work. And I integrate energy psychology principles into my work. We won't really be touching upon that tonight, but that is a big piece of my background. And I do these workshops and trainings to parents and educators, and that's called Nurturing Parents and Teachers. And I also do it to summer camps, and I do it for other organizations and things like that. So that's a little about me and why I'm here today. But we're going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen. But before I do that, if everyone is able, and I get it, some of you might be putting the kids, getting them in bath or eating dinner, and that's fine. But if you can, I'd love for you to put in the chat just the ages of your kids, so I can make sure that when I'm talking about this, I'm focused on what you want me to focus on. So if you guys wouldn't mind doing that, that'd be so helpful. Okay, 8 and 10, almost 13, 14, okay. 10, 8, and 6. Oh, 6 and almost 7. Oh, someone did back to back like me. You go, Lauren. I have them back to back also. Let's see, it was going so fast, I lost my track. 2, 4, 6, 3.5, 30, 16, and 10, twins. God bless you. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. This is really helpful. We're kind of all over the place with ages. Okay. Family childcare. Okay, great. That's fun. This all applies. And I shouldn't make assumptions, but we are working here in the Autism Alliance. I'm going to assume that some of these older kids might not be developmentally at that age. They may have other developmental needs. So I'm going to take that with a grain of salt when I'm asking you for the ages, because I do understand that perspective. Okay, thank you. All right, let's share my screen and get started. Close my chat, press play. Oop, hang on a minute. Actually, it did not successfully work. Give me one moment. What just happened? Let's try that again. Let's try to share the screen. And
This is not because of the weather, that's why.
what's that?
This is not working because of the weather, that's why.
Because of the weather, yeah.
Yeah,
You
the
know what?
weather.
Somehow it literally it shut down on me. That's why.
Okay.
So give me a second to reopen the PowerPoint because it literally just shut down on me. Wonderful. Okay. So what makes your child tick? Presented by me. You've already heard about me and what I do. Just go down. If anyone does want contact information, feel free to screenshot this. I'm also happy to send a PDF, you know, and, you know, you can maybe add the PDF to a link somehow for people to get if you want to. I'm happy to do that as well, whatever is easiest. But this is my contact information if anyone wants to reach out to me. Okay. So before I really begin, I kind of want to talk about how I explain sensory processing and in the context of autism. The way that I explain to people how one gets diagnosed with autism, and I know it's much more intricate than what I'm saying, but the way I try to explain this is there's a big bucket of characteristics, a big bucket of personality traits, characteristics. Each of us, any human being on the face of the earth, might have one or two of characteristics in this big, huge bucket of things. And all it does is make us unique, make us have our own little quirks, right? It's just who we are. Sometimes someone gets a whole handful of the characteristics in this bucket, okay? And that handful creates a situation in which the child, I'm saying child because we're talking about children, it doesn't have to be a child, but they get a handful of these characteristics and they start impeding and impacting their life or their development or their milestones because there's so many of them, okay? And so when you think about like the DSM-5 checklist for someone who qualifies for being under the diagnosis of autism, you know, it's like, you know, 2 or more of these in this category, 2 or more. So I'm just saying, forget about that clinical way of doing it, and they're throwing them all in the bucket, okay? And so every human being has 1 or 2 things in that bucket, but when you have a handful of them, then we're considered being on the spectrum, okay? Sensory processing, which is what we're going to talk about today, is one of those things where I would say, I don't know if I can say 100%, because I certainly haven't met every person in the world, but I'd like to say 99.9% of the time that children with a diagnosis of autism, when they pull out that handful of characteristics, sensory processing is one of them that's in their hand, okay? So one can have sensory quirks, one can have sensory processing challenges, dysfunction, integration issues, there's a lot of names for it, and still not be on the autistic spectrum. But all of the people who are on the autistic spectrum, chances are they have sensory processing dysfunction, sensory processing challenges, sensory processing integration issues, okay? So I just want to differentiate that if you are parents of children who are on the spectrum, you most likely have some sensory challenges going on with your kids. You're going to learn about that, but you're going to learn about yourself too today, because we all react to our sensory systems and we all have our sensory quirks. Okay, so just want to know how to put that out there and how that works in context. So how many senses do we have? We're all taught in kindergarten that we have 5 senses. The reality is we actually don't. And funny story, my son had sensory processing dysfunction, was in an early head start, in integrated preschool, and was in there for sensory systems issues that were not the 5. And they were still teaching him. He's like, got in the car one day and Buck goes, "Mommy, I learned about my 5 senses today." And I just started kind of laughing. I'm like, you literally know he's there for vestibular and proprioceptive, but you're not even teaching that to them. So it's kind of funny that we still teach it as 5, but we have more than 5. We have 7, and I'd like to argue we have more than 7, to be honest with you. And I could go on a whole separate conversation about our energy systems and all of that as well, but I won't. But I'm going to talk about the 7 today. And it's really important that we understand there are 7, and I'm going to explain them all and go through them all and how they impact ourselves and our kids. But we do have 7. And oftentimes, the reason why it's so important to understand we have 7 systems is because parents and caregivers often misunderstand a child's behavior because they don't understand that child's sensory profile. And because it's really hard for me to look at someone else's behavior if I wasn't trained the way I was, it's hard for someone to look at someone else's behavior and understand it if we can't relate to the reasons why they're acting that way. Because all of our sensory systems look a little different. Okay, so this is why it's important to understand that we have 7. Now, when we're talking about our sensory systems, we're talking about a sensory spectrum. And I use the word spectrum in like Webster definition spectrum. I'm just saying like we have this line, okay? And we either avoid sensations or we seek sensations, okay? And there, a lot of the OTs out there, have created new vocabulary and new language on what avoiding, how they document avoiding and how they document seeking. I want to keep it as basic as I can without confusing anyone. When we avoid something, it's because we're oversensitive to it. We don't want that sensation. When we seek something, we're undersensitive. We need more of it to feel it. So that's just the basic way I'm going to explain it. We all fall, every single person, if you are breathing, you fall on the spectrum. And for every sensory system, you'll fall somewhere different on the spectrum of avoiding and seeking. You might be indifferent and kind of in the middle. You might avoid a little bit, but you're not going to freak out if it happens. You might seek it a little bit because you like it, but you're fine. Or you might seek it so much that you can't function until you get it. So I just want you to think about that spectrum as I start talking about the sensory systems. Okay. So often children are misunderstood because parents don't understand the child because they can't relate to their sensory processing. Okay, so I want to talk about the cup analogy. This is a really important analogy. I'm going to use my little water bottle here as my visual here. I want you to think about all 7 systems having their very own cup. And at every moment of every day, we're trying to regulate our cup. And our cup only feels regulated, our body and our system only feels regulated when it's filled right to the rim. The problem is we all have holes at the bottom of our cup. And some of us have a teeny tiny pinhole, which means it drains so slowly. And some of us have a huge giant hole, which means it's pouring, it's emptying, it's emptying, it's emptying. So think about it. We're going to talk about each sensory system in a moment, but I'm just going to grab one for the sake of discussing it. Let's say we're talking about tactile touch. If you are someone who has a giant hole at the bottom of your cup, that means you're going to have this need to touch everything in order to fill your cup back up. And even if it goes down a little bit, that's still uncomfortable. And you're still going to want to fill it. But the lower it gets, the more agitated you're probably going to feel. But let's say, so if you have a tiny pinpoint hole and it drains really, really slow, and suddenly you have all the sensory input come in, let's just use tactile as an example, suddenly you're being touched left and right by people bumping into you in a crowd, and you didn't have a lot of room to fill the cup up to begin with, now it's overflowing. And that's really dysregulating. So when we overflow our cup, we're dysregulated. When our cup is empty, we're dysregulated. We are constantly, unconsciously, and sometimes consciously trying to balance all 7 cups at the same time as we're trying to balance our physiological cups. For example, hunger, right? So if we're starting to drain and we're getting, hungry and we're losing our fuel, we got to fill ourselves up. The minute we stop filling it up and we are lacking in our fuel and our energy and we need to eat, how well do we think straight? Not very well, right? How well do we do a task when we're feeling hungry? Not very good. How quick are we to lose our temper and lose our cool and fall apart? Much, much quicker than if our cup was full. And then also think about when you are full and you keep eating because you just love that pie so much, and then it overflows and then you're in pain and you're in discomfort. That analogy of the hunger cup, I want you to think about for every cup of every sensory system we're going to talk about. Because for the person that gets overflowed and overwhelmed, literally feel sick like you do when you feel too full. And when it's low and you're so hungry and you feel like you're starving and you can't think straight and you can't cope, that's what happens to every other sensory system also when the cup is too low. So I'm going to use this analogy a lot as we talk about the senses. Okay. Oversensitivity, extreme reactions to sensitive input. So I want to just talk about oversensitivity looks like and undersensitivity looks like, and then we'll get into the actual systems. Some people can't tolerate a sensation at all. That's the oversensitivity. They'll go out of their way to avoid a stimulation. They will run, they will hide, they will fight to avoid it. We all can relate to this when it comes to the idea of smell. I don't know about you, but I don't want to hang out with my friends in a stinky bathroom. I'm going to go out of my way to get out of a stinky, smelly bathroom. Right? Makes sense. And we might like freak out if there's no way out, like get us out of here. We open windows, we light matches, we light candles. We have so many sprays for this purpose because we're going out of our way to avoid it. When someone feels oversensitive to something and their cup is getting overfull, they're going to go out of their way too, just like when we're smelling a stinky bathroom. Okay, so that's just a sort of analogy of what you to think about the sense of smell, how reactive we can be the same for every other sensory system. In fact, I might actually feel sick to my stomach when I smell something that really what I really don't like the bathroom smell. I might actually get nauseous. I might actually vomit, right? We can have physiological sensations in our body from the result of a cup overflowing, no matter what sensory system it is. Then the extreme reaction to sensory input for undersensitivity. This is where you don't feel it that much and you need so much more to feel it. Some people need an excessive amount of input or sensation in order to feel anything at all. This is known as undersensitivity. So they search for ways to seek it out. Okay, so an example of this might be, I am someone who, I'm going to explain what proprioceptive is in more depth in a moment, but I'm someone who needs proprioceptive, meaning I need input into my body. I'm not so seeking it that you're going to see me playing tackle football because that doesn't feel good to me. I don't like that much input into my body, but I really do need some to feel anything and to feel organized. So I'm going to go out of my way. So I really can't fall asleep at night unless I have a blanket on me, even if it's 100 degrees in the room. I can't settle my body. My nervous system will not calm until I have it. And so I'll go out of my way to get it in order for me to feel calm and regulated. Okay, so we seek out that thing in order to feel okay. If we don't have it and our cup is not full, we will do whatever it takes to get it because we want to feel regulated. We want to feel good. So that is what I mean by this terminology. Okay, so vestibular system. We're going to start talking about each system, and the vestibular system is going to be the first one we're going to talk about. So vestibular system is one of the ones that we all know we have, but we forget to teach when we teach them the 5 senses. Vestibular provides information in relation to our head position, our head movement, relationship with gravity, balance. It's what makes us feel dizzy. Okay, it's the equilibrium in between our ears. It's about how does it feel when it's off balance. For some people, feeling off balance feels thrilling and good, and for others it is nauseating. Okay, so the vestibular system, I'm going to explain to you what it's like for me, and I want you to think about what it's like for you for a moment. Think about the spectrum. Do you avoid the sensation? Do you seek it? For vestibular system, I avoid it. And I avoid it quite significantly, actually, because I feel totally dysregulated. My cup overflows with even the tiniest amount of vestibular input, which means my hole in my cup must be really tiny because it overflows fast. I love children, and I used to teach a ton of enrichment classes, and I used to teach this fun little yoga class. And there was one song where it'd be like, now shake your head, turn around. And I learned pretty quickly that I can't do it. I literally can't shake my head like that, and I can't turn around because then I'm like holding on to the wall and like bracing myself and get just regularly disoriented, and I can't keep teaching. The kids are like, well, what's going on? I can't focus. I'm too dysregulated. I'm someone who, as a kid, would never do I'd do a somersault if I had to, but you weren't going to see me try to do a cartwheel. You weren't going to see me try to do a handstand. Being upside down was not my friend. Okay, I would do anything to get out of doing that. Whereas there's other people who go to amusement parks, wait in 2-hour lines just to get on the spinning cups so that they can feel that, and they seek it and they love it. So think about yourself right now, where you are on this spectrum, and then think about where your kids might fall on this. And let me explain what it looks like in kids and how it could be problematic. So I used to see this all the time working with the early childhood age, where they're just learning how to use their bodies. You might see them on the playground starting to climb up on some kind of a structure, and they'll put one leg up, but the other leg is still literally on the ground, and they're freaking out, and they're like, help me, and you're like, just put your foot down, like the ground's right there, you're barely off of the ground. But the fact that their system is off, their equilibrium is off, feels so unsettling to them. They don't feel safe. Okay. Or someone who totally seeks it and is just constantly spinning, or constantly looking at things that spin because that sensation feels so good and they want their cup full, and it's so organizing. And so we all know that there's plenty of kids out there, and plenty of kids who are on the spectrum, who really love to watch things move and spin, or like to spin themselves. And that is because of they are trying to regulate their cup. Now, let me back up and explain something about the whole cup analogy. We can maybe tolerate 1 or 2 cups slightly being off at a time. 1 cup might be a little overflowing. 1 cup might be a little bit low. We can tolerate it, but we are not good at tolerating. And some people can't tolerate more than 1 cup off. They just can't. But if you have 7 cups plus your hunger cup, plus your tired cup, plus your attention cup, there's a social attention piece that we're not even talking about. Okay, so we're up to about 8 or 9 cups. We could keep going. We are constantly regulating these cups. If you have several of them that are too low or too overflowing, you can't function. Kids can't function. It is so dysregulating. So it makes perfect sense that a child will try to keep one of those cups full at all times, or full as much as possible, because it really feels grounding and good, because they can deal with the other cups if they might be off. So that's what it presents for vestibular. I mean, there's a reason why one of the toys that was developed in the 70s, a sit and spin, is still sold today, because some people love this sensation. Vestibular also plays a role in movement in general. It's not just about spinning, it's movement. So some kids might not like to run, some kids might love to do it. It's just their body, it's just the movement, okay? So that's vestibular. Then we have proprioceptive system, and that is one that we never talk about, but it is so part of our everyday. It is how our body feels in space. It's our joints, our muscles, and our tendons, the sensations in which we feel. So we totally understand proprioceptive when we think about newborns, but somehow we just forget about it after that, and I don't know why. But when you think about it, you have a brand newborn baby and they're totally disorganized. What is one of the first things you're going to do to try to organize them? You're going to swaddle them. You're going to go, bring them into their center, tie them tightly around, muscles, joints, tendons, feeling input. Okay. What do we do with the baby? We pat them on the back, proprioceptive. We bounce them. That's vestibular because movement, and their little bottoms hitting our, whatever is below us, our knee or whatever. And they're getting the proprioceptive. Okay. And we understand why there are the bouncy seats. We understand all of these things like, oh, wait, that makes sense. They love the proprioceptive, but we sort of just forget about it. But it plays such a role, and we have to think about the cup for this. So like I said, I'm someone who seeks it because I can't settle down without some pressure on my body. I also don't really feel that I'm doing anything unless I'm doing it hard. I'm heavy fisted. So my dentist yells at me because I brush way too hard my gums. And I have to trick my brain by getting an electric toothbrush, a heavy one. So my hand feels like it's doing more work. So I don't push so hard because I need to have that proprioceptive. But I would never turn it on because it would vibrate. My vestibular system would go off and I would feel nauseous from brushing my teeth. Right? So that's how it shows up for me. So I want you to think about for yourself, how does it show up for you? So to give some examples, what we see with kids. A kid who avoids oversensitive to proprioceptive, they might be the kid where you go over and you like put your arm around them, or you kind of like pat them on the back and they're like, ow, that hurts. And you're like, I did not hurt you. Like I barely touched you. But you have to understand to this child that their nerves in their body send messages. So what is a sensory system? Sensory system is nerves sending messages to the brain, and the brain deciding what they think about that message and then react. So people who have severe sensitivity, their nerves are actually sending more powerful, more potent messages to the brain, and then the nervous system is reacting more intensely. It does actually hurt them. It does actually feel uncomfortable. Then you have the people who seek it. And I admit I seek it, but I'm not overly seeking. But I gotta tell you, there are plenty of kiddos out there who will literally look at a group of kids playing and be like, score, I'm gonna be a bowling ball and they're gonna be my pins. And they're gonna rev up their engine and run and just plow right into them and knock them all down. And every other kid's gonna be upset and crying and mad. That kid's in there's glory. He's smiling, he's loving it. And I see teachers or parents go and be like, and this is a true story. I actually did a consultation with a child who was kicked out of their early childhood center. And when we got to the bottom of it, he was being a bully, he was hurting other children, and he kept denying it. And they're like, we'll keep him if he wouldn't deny it, but he's denying it. And then I got to the bottom of it. Kids only know their own experiences. They don't know any other truth, but from what they perceive through their lens. And they kept saying, you're hurting other kids. And he thought it felt amazing to plow into these kids and knock them down, and thought that they were being mean and lying and pretending and crying and getting him in trouble.
Jill, we have a question for clarification. Is that okay?
Of course.
It's kind of on the cusp. Is throwing your body into a armchair or into a couch proprioceptive seeking?
100% yes. Yes. Thank you for asking that. Absolutely. So you can see with this kiddo, he was getting in trouble and he didn't even know, he didn't understand, he didn't have the cognitive understanding because it only felt good to him. And so he thought everyone was lying when he said, and he wasn't lying. He's like, I'm not hurting them. They said, why did you throw your body into them? Then he maybe tell them. But they were saying, why are you hurting your friends? And the kids are literal. And he didn't believe he was hurting them because it felt good to him. Right? So yes, you see these kids who are proprioceptive, you see them flopping on the couch and rolling around on the couch. You see them plopping themselves down, just completely pushing themselves in. You see these, they're the elbow kids, the kids who you want to snuggle with them, and they're putting their elbow and their knee and it hurts because they just want to dig into you. That is proprioceptive. So we can understand how it gets too extreme for some. It can get really problematic and look like behavioral issues, or it could get really, really bad where a kiddo is so overstimulated and overwhelmed by that kind of pressure that they're going to have enormous avoidance behaviors, because the possibility of it happening to them and feeling that kind of pressure into their body is so anxiety provoking that you'll see them darting out of places or not going in places. Okay, and this brings me to tactile, which is a similar idea. Tactile is touch, which is different. Proprioceptive, you do need to be touched to have proprioceptive input, but it's more about what the inside of the body feels, whereas tactile is more about the outside of the body. And the nerves endings on our skin, send messages really fast to up to our brain. And we understand that it's touch, but touching something and being touched are very different things, very different experiences. And because when you're touching something, you actually have some of your other sensory systems working for you, like vision. You're seeing it, so you're bracing yourself before, as opposed to being touched. Your nervous system may not have a chance to really have any heads up, and it's a shock to the nervous system. So if you seek tactile, those are the kiddos who are touching everything all the time, the kids you never want to bring into a store. They're just constantly touching other kids, and as you can imagine, that causes problems where kids don't want to be touched and they're just into everything. I call it like the pig. I'm probably dating myself here if any of you remember Charlie Brown stuff, but Pigpen, where he just dives right in. These are the kids who are gluing their arms, painting themselves and just can't get enough. And then you have the opposite. You have the avoiders, who it feels so uncomfortable when they're being touched. The best analogy I can give you I give this analogy with the perception of tactile system, but I want you to understand it applies to all the systems. Okay. But for me, being tickled feels really, really bad. I don't like being tickled. It causes me anxiety. It's not something I never enjoyed. I don't laugh and think it's funny. I'm like crying and think it's painful. It's so uncomfortable for me. So I'm a little bit of an avoidant on tactile in that way. But I love hugs. I love, but when I feel like it. But that tiny creepy crawly feeling that a bug on you might give you, I don't like that sensation. So I want you to imagine a big bucket of live spiders. Imagine if I don't like the feeling of tactile, then I'm not going to like the idea of a spider crawling on me. Certainly not going to like the idea of a bucket full of live spiders. Now imagine this bucket's over my head 24/7, but in certain situations, it gets tilted. And it's not a matter of when will it dump on me. I'm sorry, it's not a matter of if it will dump on me. It's a matter of when will it dump on me. It will dump on me. Because the reality is I will be touched at some point during the day. So if I'm walking around with this bucket of live spiders waiting for it to pour on me, am I going to be calm or am I going to be so anxious? Think about it. If you have a kid whose tactile system is overstimulated and the cup is really full and they really don't want it to overflow, but they know they walk into school and it's going to be, because there's going to be so many other kids in their space. They know the bucket of spiders is going to dump on them. You're going to see some high anxiety behaviors. You're going to see avoidances. You might even see them be violent. I'm telling you, if someone's about to dump a bucket of spiders on me, I probably would get violent. I'd probably push them away because I would go into fight or flight. So this is what it's like when kids' tactile systems, are oversensitive and they're being made to be put into a situation where it's inevitable they're going to be touched, especially if you have little kids, when like toddlers, they have no boundaries. They don't even understand that another person is standing there. You're just furniture to pull up on, right? But all ages, this is true. You're going to be touched. I worked in early intervention, as I mentioned, for years, and there was an OT that was one of the leaders. And during staff meetings, she always sat in the back of the room, and we'd all have to turn around to. So I made my own presumptuous perceptions that I'm like, why isn't she's important? She should be up front with the rest of the leaders. One day, what you making Making assumptions for someone on someone's reasons for things never ever flies, because you never know what's going on for them. I talked to her later and found out that she has significant tactile issues. And she always has to be the last in line for things. And she has to be back there because she can't focus and concentrate when there's people in her space and she's worried someone's going to touch her. She needs to be behind everyone and see everyone in front of her. And she needs proprioceptive input. So she's pushing herself against the wall. And that's how she stays organized for the meeting. So that's what tactile looks like. Then we have the oral system. And a lot of times we think it's just taste, but there's so much more happening. We have more sensory receptors in our mouth than any other part of the body. Sorry, did someone say something?
No.
Okay, great. So we have more sensory receptors in our mouth than any other part of our body, which is why it hurts so bad when we bite our tongue or we bite our cheek, right? Because there's so many nerves. There's a reason there's so many nerves. There's a reason why Mother Nature has babies put everything in their mouth, because Mother Nature wants to make sure that we learn about our world as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. They put things in. I don't know any of you have ever tried to get your baby, to stop mouthing things, or a kid who stays in the oral stage to get them to stop putting things in their mouth. It's like an endless battle because you're fighting Mother Nature. Mother Nature actually wants them to put everything in their mouth. Mother Nature didn't think about COVID, didn't think about the germs and stuff when it created us. It just wants us to put everything in our mouth so that we can learn about it. Because there's so many nerves that send messages to the brain. And think about it, your taste buds taste it, but then your tactile sensory system in your mouth is happening because you're feeling the food in your mouth. But guess what you got to do to get it to your mouth? You got to touch it tactilely with your hands. And guess what? You're going to look at it. You're going to bring it up. What's right above your mouth? Your nose. So now you have to smell it. Okay. And we wonder why there are kids who have so many eating issues and feeding issues and sensory issues around food, because putting things in our mouth is the one thing that pretty much makes every sensory system come online. Maybe not vestibular, because you're not really off balance, but you have to touch it, you have to smell it, you have to see it, you have to taste it, you have to feel it in your mouth, then you chew it, that's proprioceptive. Is it crunchy? Is it mushy? Is it soft? Is it chewy? So it makes sense that if a child has dysregulated cups and avoids and has a lot of avoidances, a lot of cups that overflow, they're likely going to have some feeding issues around this because the sensory systems are just overwhelmed and it's too scary. Okay, so that's how it shows up there. And then we have vision, which is obviously sight. But vision is more complex than we might give it credit for. It's obviously what we see, but it's very closely linked to our vestibular system. As we know, if you get car sick, if you're in the front seat, you're better off than you're on the back seat because you can see right in front of you. And vision is the first line of defense. It's what protects us. We see it. Our nervous system goes, that looks fluffy like teddy bear. Okay, I'm going to prepare myself to touch that and assume it's going to feel fluffy and soft, and it braces ourselves. There are people out there who get really disorganized really quickly and really easily when there's too much visual stimulation. It's too much to look at and it's overwhelming and the cup is overflowing. And then there are people who actually need to see it all before they can even get organized. That's the person who has to dump out all the toys or all the things. If you have a project, you need to put every piece out in front of you before you can even dive in. You can't even get your thoughts straight until it's all in front of you. You are someone who seeks a lot of that vision stimulation. And if you're someone who walks in a room that's disorganized, your brain hurts, then you avoid it. Okay. Then we have hearing, auditory. And we get this one, I think. This is one that we understand a lot more easily because most of us do get irritated by some loud noises and whatnot. But people hear things at different intensities. So what might be loud for you might not be loud for someone else and vice versa. And we can have some pretty big reactions to this. So I was just checking the time to see how we're doing. Okay, so let's think of it this way. You know that there are kiddos out there who can't handle a lot of noise or loud noises. They immediately start going like this, screaming or crying. They might not get that upset, but they might be humming, maybe while they're eating or while they're doing things. They're doing that to drown out the sounds because they're trying to regulate their sound cup. Then you have, the people who need sounds. I remember I had a friend who had to have the TV and the radio on in order for her to do her homework. And I couldn't think straight, but that was the only way she was going to be able to do it. So we have the people who need the noise, people who need to control the noise and manage the noise. So that is auditory. Now we have smell. And I talked a little bit about the smell before. We all have smells that make us feel sick. I don't think there's very rarely would any of us not have one that we dislike. But for some people, smell is so sensitive no matter what the smell is. Or they may I have one client who loves the smell, won't eat many things and doesn't like a lot of smells, but loves the smell of tuna fish, loves the smell of pickles, loves extreme smells. And then you have the kids who can't stand those smells. I once worked with a kid who had, the school didn't quite realize the extent of the resistance to smell, the oversensitivity. And they were doing a project where the whole class was undoing the shells of a hard-boiled egg. So you can imagine the smell, how strong it was when 20 kids were peeling eggs at the same time. And this kid just flipped its switch, just went into fight or flight. Because what happens is the nerves send the message to the brain, and the brain says, I don't like this. It doesn't feel good. And then an alarm goes off and says, well, then I must be in danger. Now, is he really in danger? No. But the brain doesn't know how to differentiate. It says, this feels overwhelming. This is too much. It's as if it's in pain. When we're in pain, we equate that as danger. So this kid threw his chair back, fell back, got up, ran out of the school, ran into the parking lot. And this is one of those kids who never breaks the rules, who's like a stickler to everyone else to do the rules. One of those kids who just would never do anything they're not supposed to, but he was not thinking, because when we're in fight or flight, we don't think. We just go into that neurological protection system, and he just took off. So you can see how that can play a role. And then we have a society that loves smells. And in fact, there's so many commercial marketing that loves the fact that people love smells, because you can go into any store and you'll find a million scented candles and a million, everything has a scent, this lotion, that lotion, we get it. And we might go out of our way to get away from a smell. Like, I'm not going to be hanging out in the bathroom. I'm going to light the candle. I'm going to light the match, or go out of the way as running away from a smell. But we might seek it. We might go out of our way. You might have a special fragrance that you love, and you go to a store and they don't have it. You're not going to even buy a different one. You're going to go to another store to see if they have it, because you're going to go out of your way to get something that makes you feel organized and good. That is true for all sensory systems. If you have a hole in your cup that's big and it's draining fast, you are going to do whatever you can to fill it with a thing that makes you feel good. Okay. So that is olfactory. So I wanted to make sure we got through all 7 systems, which we did, yay. And I wanted to give you a glimpse of what it looks like when we avoid it or we seek it, when our cup gets too full, when our cup gets too empty. I want you to understand that if we have multiple cups that are dysregulated, we're not going to be able to function. We just can't. And you're going to see kids fall apart or have behaviors that are seeking things and you don't understand, you misunderstand it. Or then have behaviors where they're avoiding things and you're not going to understand it, and you're going to misunderstand it, and you're going to look at these all as negative behaviors rather than communication as to what state their nervous system is in. Now, something I didn't mention to you guys, which I want to share, is that this training, I typically teach it in a 2-hour training. I've also taught it in a 5-hour training before. I often will train early childhood educators a full day training on this, because there's so much to learn about what to do when you have a child who seeks this or avoids that, and how do you integrate your classroom and how do you integrate things in your home. We could talk about it for hours on end. I had to give you the Cliff Notes. So I'm going to give you a few more Cliff Notes, but I'm going to stay at the end and answer any questions that people have, because I'm sure there are many, because it's just an overview. But if you want to learn more, we can figure out how to do that. Maybe I can come back. Maybe, I do present workshops outside of this. Maybe you could be on my newsletter. And if I'm doing another one, I can let you know. But I just wanted to explain to you that we're just scratching the surface. There's so much depth that we could get into more. But I want to give you as much as I can. So I'm going to keep going. Do we outgrow our sensory quirks? Yes and no. And what do I mean by this? Sensory systems mature because it's our nervous system. The more exposure we have to things, the more desensitized we get. So in some ways, we can desensitize to things. But I was talking to a 50-plus-year woman who was an occupational therapist in my early intervention center when I worked there, who was still needing to sit back of the room and have everyone in front of her and push up against the back. Okay, so we don't always fully outgrow these things. What happens is we learn socially appropriate ways of dealing with them and compensating and making it work for us. If you are someone who is auditory sensitive, you are not going to pick a career in a cubicle where all the phones are ringing and everyone's talking at the same time. You would feel like you're going insane. We have the luxury as adults to put ourselves in situations that are in alignment with our nervous systems. I never forget, I was doing an evaluation early intervention for a family, and the kid kept getting kicked out of school because they were jumping off furniture and swinging on things and whatnot. So when I did the evaluation and assessment and I was getting background on the parents, the mom's on a SWAT team. She literally jumps out of helicopters and does all this thrilling stuff. And I'm like, okay, apples don't fall far from trees. And she clearly picked a profession that met her neurological makeup. She needs that kind of input. A less significant situation is, so as adults, you might know you just need to exercise in the morning to be able to concentrate and think all day. If you don't exercise and you miss a day, you're grumpy, you're miserable. You just know that about you. You need to run. Vestibular and proprioceptive. Feet go into the ground, boom, boom, proprioceptive, running, vestibular. You may know that about yourself. Well, a kid might know that about themselves, but when they run away from you, they're in trouble. Right? They don't have the luxuries that we have. So we figure out how to put ourselves in situations. They have to go to school. They have to go to cafeterias. We drag them to birthday parties. We have family over who want hugs and want to pinch your cheeks. They don't have the ability to say no to things the way we do. So we outgrow them slightly, but we also learn coping mechanisms, but we also can put ourselves into situations that kids can't. That's my answer to that question. And I want to talk a little bit about the sensitive child. How do we help the kid? I think this is wrong. It says the undersensitive child sensory diet. I'm sorry, that's supposed to say the oversensitive. That's correct. Undersensitive. You see, it's getting late for me. Undersensitive child needs a sensory diet, meaning if their cup is emptying and they need more of that sensation in order to feel full, feel regulated, then we're going to want to think about it as a diet. Okay. You can't go the whole day without eating. You got to have a meal, you got to have a snack, a meal, a snack, maybe another snack, right? So if you have a kid who needs proprioceptive input and they're going to start banging themselves into things and not be able to concentrate on what they're supposed to be doing, you want to give them as much proprioceptive throughout the day in little bits as much as you can. And I would love to tell you more detail, all the ways to do that, but just a little sprinkle of an idea is they might wear their backpack all day because they could feel more weight on their body. You might go over and do some pressure on their body throughout the day, just so they're filling their cup up. Okay. So a sensory diet means we're giving it plenty of times so the cup never gets too low. Because if it gets too low, you have a dysregulated kid, sometimes there's no coming back. Okay. And then we have, for the kids who are oversensitive, we got the cold pool analogy, which I like to use. And when I think about the cold pool analogy, I'm meaning What happens if a kid is afraid to swim and you pick them up and you throw them in anyway? Are you going to have a kid that will ever go anywhere near the pool? Nope. They'll probably avoid the whole parking lot. Will they trust the person who threw them in? Nope. They'll be so angry and have no trust. Now, what if the kid who's afraid to go swimming, you fine, you sit at the gate and watch everyone else swim for a while. Then maybe you move up, get a little closer to hear what they're saying. Maybe you even get to the edge and you dangle your feet in the water. Maybe you even sprinkle some water on them. Maybe you even get them to the stairs and they put their feet in. And maybe you work your way down. Maybe you never even get the head underwater. It's just to the waist, but you got them in. That is how they're going to trust you. And that is how they're going to eventually be okay with swimming. This is the same thing for any sensory system that they get overwhelmed and they're afraid of. If you want to desensitize them, you can't overwhelm them. You have to desensitize them very slowly with just a little bit and help them in. My kid was so oversensitive to so many things when he was little that if there was a birthday party somewhere new, I always had to bring him to that place first when it was pretty empty. And then slowly wean him in to more people coming, and then bring him back when the party was actually going to happen so he would know what to expect. For what, it's one example. Okay. So I have lots of examples of what to do, but I think I went over that. So I'm going to skip that. We want to prepare and ask permission for these kids. A lot of times they feel like it's happening to them and their nervous system gets so overwhelmed. Oftentimes we have to prepare them and say, okay, I'm going to pick you up now. I'm going to hold your hand because it's not safe. And if we just go and hold their hand, they're going to freak out. I remember my kiddo had these issues, and I remember we were at Children's Museum in Boston, and I have two little ones. They're 1 year apart. So I was watching one and my mother-in-law was watching the other, and he wanted to reach something. And my mother-in-law didn't think anything of it and just picked him up so he could reach it. But he had no idea she was going to do that. And he freaked out for his vestibular system. And he felt unbalanced. And the shrieks and yells that came out of him, I was like, oh my God, like security came running in, like trying to figure out what was going on. And I was like, oh, okay, grandma, you gotta warn him before you pick him up. It was just one of those situations. And I didn't really have time to tell you my whole story of my son and his sensory issues, but he had them significantly. And I want to talk about that a little bit real quick. When are sensory problems a problem? When do you have to intervene? When there's behavior problems. So like the kid that was plowing into other kids and seeing nothing wrong with it, or running away when they shouldn't run away. When it interferes with their developmental milestones. And that I wanted to share a little bit about my son very briefly. When he was very little, his first year of life, he had so many sensory issues, but we didn't realize it was sensory at first. He was just really delayed. He was smart, but he was scoring low on his cognitive skills. And it was because he wouldn't touch anything because he had tactile defensiveness. When you're a baby and you don't play with things, and then you're tested in early intervention to see if you can do certain things, if you know it and you've never explored that toy, then you're not going to know what to do with it, right? So we had to desensitize him to tactile stuff so that he would be able to keep up with his cognitive skills and his fine motor skills, right? Then we couldn't figure out why he wouldn't crawl and why he wouldn't walk. And we were just kept at it trying to, he didn't end up walking until he was about 18 months old. And of course he learned to crawl the day before his crawling. It was like a funny little, actually it wasn't even that, it was it was like a butterfly stroke. He figured out to do that the day before my daughter was born. So I didn't know he was mobile, and I had a newborn baby and he was 1 year old. And I put him down for a minute, and I just had a C-section, and he just took off down the corridor. And I'm running with a newborn baby with a C-section yelling, stop that baby. Because I had no idea how quick he got because I was in the hospital. But he was very delayed. And we realized it was because he had defensiveness to his vestibular system. Why would a baby get on all fours and rock if they're afraid to move? Why would they crawl if their equilibrium is going to be off? So he figured out how to crawl by never having to move his ears. He started doing the butterfly stroke so that he never had a tilt. So we had to do early intervention to help him overcome the sensation of vestibular system. And then he's never stopped moving ever since. But that's what we need to do for him. And that's how it shows up developmentally. When else do we need to intervene? When their coping strategies are just depleted and we're having kids that are melting down and falling apart all the time. Okay, so where can you get help? Most of you who are here are way past this, okay? Sometimes I do this training for people who, you know, really don't know anything about how to receive supports for their families. I'm going to assume most of you already have started to do that because you've already maybe gotten a diagnosis or you're suspecting a diagnosis. You may already have ABA in place or other systems in place. So I don't have to go through all of this, but I'm just going to stop share. See all of your beautiful faces. So I'm not going to go over all those details, but we kind of know that birth to 3 is early intervention, 3 and up is Department of Education. But the thing I just want to point out before people go, and I could stay for questions, is it's really tricky because sensory processing dysfunction, sensory processes integration, whatever you want to call it, has many names. Why? Because for whatever reason, the people who make the decision as to what a diagnosis is and put in the DSM-5 have decided to not let it be an actual diagnosis. So there's no one name because there's no book where you can find it in with the actual diagnosis. Because, and this is what I heard, take it for what it's worth, it's just what I've heard through the grapevine, that people who sat around the table who decided what diagnosis should be, this came up and they said, we really can't pathologize sensory processing because every human being has sensory processing. And if we put sensory processing dysfunction, then we're pathologizing something that everyone has. And so they agreed to not put it as a main diagnosis. It's a characteristic of other things, but it's not its own thing. I would like to say BS to that because everybody feels sad and everyone gets a little depressed sometimes, but we still have depression and major depressive disorders. Everyone has anxiety, but we still have anxiety disorders. It cuts to a point where it's not functional for us anymore. And for whatever reason, the people who decide these things haven't agreed or seen it that way. So it's really challenging to get services for kids because it's not an actual diagnosis. That is why so many people have to get outside OT support because they have their ways of medically putting it. You know, there's balance issues. There's, you know, they have ways of forming it in order to get services. Schools, it's really tricky. Schools will only support sensory processing if it's truly impacting their functioning and being able to access the curriculum. And they're looking at it in a much different way, and it's harder to get. And it's really frustrating, 100%. And it's just real. It is real. And anyone who works with kids and anyone who works in this field knows it. And there are so many resources for kids. I'm not trying to say there's no resources for you. I'm just trying to explain why it is the way it is. Now, if your child is on the spectrum and already has a diagnosis of being on the autistic spectrum, you're all set because sensory processing stuff can be paired with that diagnosis and can receive services for that. But it's those kiddos who don't necessarily fall in that category, but still have those issues, that it's really challenging. Just wanted to differentiate and explain that. So, like I said, I'm scratching the surface. There's so much more I'd love to share with you guys. I'm so happy to stay and answer any questions or any comments or whatever's on your mind, but I want to respect people's time because they knew they were coming for an hour. If anyone needs to go, no hard feelings, but I am here and ready to be here as your resource. And I'll check the chat to see if there's anything in there to be answered. Otherwise, you guys can just unmute and start speaking or raise your hands. Let's